Hello dear students, you are welcome in this video. Dear students, we are making videos on IKS or Indian Knowledge System. So we have made a series and this is the next video in the same series. In the last video, we talked about classical languages, and in this video, we are going to talk about a particular classical language, that is Sanskrit. Here you see, we'll talk about the Sanskrit and the relevance of Sanskrit, importance of Sanskrit, and how Sanskrit is important as a classical language. So let's understand what is there in the classical language in Sanskrit. So here is the definition of classical language. Actually, we have discussed this definition in the previous video, but still in this video, let me remind this definition. So classical language is a language with large body of ancient written literature and an independent literary tradition. They are often associated with a rich cultural heritage and historical significance. So classical language is nothing but we find it has its roots in ancient period or before common era, and we find there is a vast body of written literature or oral literature in that particular language, and it has the rich cultural heritage and historical significance. Now, how Sanskrit is developed in India, or the growth of Sanskrit has given itself a very significance to cultural heritage and historical heritage in Indian history, as we find. Now, let's understand the role of Sanskrit as a classical language in Indian languages. For example, we'll start with the historical significance. What is the historical significance of Sanskrit? As we know that we find the root of Sanskrit in Indo-Aryan language, and its root is stressed second millennia before common era. So it's a ancient language, Sanskrit is itself, and we find its origin in Indo-Aryan language. So when we think about different types of texts composed in Sanskrit, we find that the three main, or we can say that important religions in India, for example, we have Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Now, the texts or the religious texts of these religions are written in Sanskrit. So, it is the language of Hinduism, language of Buddhism, and language of Jainism, which are very important religions in India. Now, we have two forms of Sanskrit. For example, the first form is Vedic Sanskrit and the second is classical Sanskrit. Now, when we think about Vedic Sanskrit, we find that so Vedic Sanskrit is the earliest form which is found in Vedas before 1500 to 500 before Christ. So in ancient period or earlier, these Vedas were composed, and these Vedas were composed in Sanskrit, and this form is considered as the earliest form of Sanskrit. And then we find that the form of classical Sanskrit developed or grew, where it was refined form and standardized form. So it is standardized by Panini, as we find his Ashtadhyayi. So Ashtadhyayi is a text composed by Panini, in which we find he composed the grammar of Sanskrit for the first time. So here you can see this is the picture of Panini, and Panini composed the grammar of Sanskrit, and there we find it was standardized by Panini in the 4th century BCE. So this is the historical background or historical significance of Sanskrit. Now, next, let's understand what type of texts were composed and what is the contribution of Sanskrit as a language in the literature or literary canon. So, we have first Vedic texts. In Vedic texts, we have fundamental 4 Vedas. The Vedas, which are very important not only in Hinduism but as a philosophical text. So, we have Rig Veda, Samveda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. These are the 4 fundamental texts or Vedas in Sanskrit. So, which are composed of hymns, prayers, rituals, philosophical teachings, etc. So, we find that in Vedas there are different types of things included. For example, we have different types of rituals. Still, these rituals are used by several people, or they have the existence of these rituals and prayers and hymns in their routine life or in their mundane life still today. Then we have Brahmanas, then we have Aryanakas and Upanishads. So again, these 3 texts also are very important, which talks about the fundamental Vedas. So this is the next form, we can say that, of these Vedas. Basically, it is composed in prose. So these texts also are important, which are composed in Sanskrit, which comments on the Vedas itself. So we have the extended form of rituals in these three texts: Brahmanas, Aryanakas, and Upanishads. Then we have the great epics in Sanskrit. The first is Mahabharata and the second is Ramayana. So Mahabharata is composed by Ved Vyasa and Ramayana is composed by Valmiki. So these two epics are one of the greatest epics in the world, which are composed in Sanskrit, and we have so many renderings of these both the epics. For example, when we think about Ramayana, so Ramayana has thousands of renderings in different types of languages, from Sanskrit into the other languages, and we have the translations, renderings, and dramas based on these two great texts or two great epics in India, which are composed in Sanskrit. So this is the texts and its contribution. Then we have classical literature. So in Sanskrit we find a very rich literature. For example, we have kavyas or poetry, and in poetry we find Kalidasa composed basically in Sanskrit. So Abhijanya Shakuntalam is a classical text composed in Sanskrit. Then we have Meghduta, then we have Bharavi and Bhavabhuti. These two poets also composed several poems, several kind of poetry in Sanskrit, which is called as classical literature. Then we have Natakas or dramas. Again, Kalidasa's Abhijan Shakuntalam is a verse drama or verse play. We find it is a natak or a drama in Sanskrit. Then Bhasa composed dramas in Sanskrit. Then we have Shudraka's Mricha Katika. This is also a play or a drama in Sanskrit. So we find this type of classical literature in Sanskrit. Actually, I have taken only important or main classical literature from Sanskrit. There are so many texts, several kind of poetry, several kind of dramas are found in Sanskrit, but these are very important dramas or well-known dramas or classical literature. Then let's understand the scientific and technical texts. So different types of texts are composed in Sanskrit, or Sanskrit is the origin of all these philosophical texts and scientific treatises. For example, we have mathematics and astronomy. In mathematics and astronomy, we have the names like Aryabhata, Varahamihira, and Bhaskara, who composed several treatises in Sanskrit, and still we find its relevance in today's life. Then we have in medicine like Charaka and Sushruta composed, and we find the medicinal texts or the texts in the field of medicine. Then we have grammar and linguistics. In grammar and linguistics, Panini is very important author, and he composed Ashtadhyayi, or Ashtadhyayi is nothing but the grammar of Sanskrit. Then we have Patanjali's Mahabhashya and Kattayana's Vartika. So these are some of the texts which are important in linguistics, or when we think about language or study language, we must think about these texts in Sanskrit, because most of the traditions, grammatical traditions, linguistic traditions, or different types of linguistic components are borrowed from these texts. Next, we have philosophical texts, and in philosophical texts, we have Yoga Sutra by Patanjali and Brahma Sutra by Badrayana. And again, we have some of Smritis in Sanskrit philosophical texts. So what are Smritis? Smritis are nothing but a different types of text. For example, we have Manu Smriti. So Smritis are just, if we render it literally, it means memories. So these texts are based on the rituals and some of the social forms or social norms. So we have Manusmriti by Manu, which is in the form of Smritis. So these are some of the texts. Next, again, we have its influence and legacy. So what is the influence of Sanskrit and its legacy? So we need to consider all these points while thinking about its influence and legacy. So linguistic influence, its influence is found on all the languages in India or around the Asian countries. So it has a great influence. For example, we can take any language, we find the influence of Sanskrit in that language in India. Then cultural impact. So the cultural heritage of Sanskrit is so vast, and hence we find that the cultural impact through the Sanskrit texts. For example, we have the Ramayana and Mahabharata. In India, you go everywhere or anywhere, you find the influence of the Ramayana and Mahabharata in the life of people, and hence their culture is impacted by those texts and the language itself. So, Sanskrit, again, philosophical thought. So there are so many texts which are written in Sanskrit or composed in Sanskrit, which talks about philosophy, the philosophy of human existence, the philosophy of human life, and the living. So all these things we find in different types of texts composed in Sanskrit. Again, we need to think about the global influence. Still, around the world, there are so many scholars who are working or studying Sanskrit in different ways. So they are thinking about the Sanskrit and its heritage or the literary heritage, and we find there is research still going in that particular area. So it has global influence. So many global scholars are working on Sanskrit. So what is the modern relevance of Sanskrit? So revival efforts, there are so many revival efforts. For example, we find that in national education policy, the native languages are focused, or they are given more importance, and in that we find Sanskrit is one of the languages. So the revival efforts are going on by the side of government, or government is working on the revival of so many languages including Sanskrit. Then we find research and education. So uh, in Sanskrit, there are so many scholars who are conducting research on different types of texts, on its philosophy and linguistic traditions. Then we have cultural preservation. So Sanskrit has a vast body of texts, or the we find that philosophical, classical, or literary or text, and these texts are uh, preserved in the form of translations, in the form of other kind of ways, and hence its cultural preservation is done through these type of activities, not only by government but by the scholars all around India. In different types of universities, we find the departments of Sanskrit and departments of linguistics and departments of language translations are working on preservation of Sanskrit and its culture. So this is all about Sanskrit as a classical language. I hope you got the idea of classical language and basically Sanskrit. So in the next video, we'll talk about another language. If you have any query, any problem, you can comment below in the comment section. We'll try to understand or try to solve your problems. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you very much.